Hello and welcome to Enchantment of Eternity's review for The Wounded, which is episode 12 of season 4 of Star Trek The Next Generation. This video is a part of a series of videos where I review episodes of Star Trek as determined by my user polls. The episode to win my latest user poll for The Next Generation is the 4th season episode, The Wounded. So The Wounded is the episode where the Enterprise has to team up with a Cardassian ship to hunt down a Starfleet officer who had gone rogue and is attacking Cardassian ships against order, and Picard needs to maintain the peace by trying to track down the Starfleet officer and stop him. The captain in question, however, used to serve with Chief Miles O'Brien, who Miles O'Brien at first defends the officer, but then eventually when Picard comes to an impasse and can't stop him from trying to destroy Cardassian ships, Miles O'Brien manages to talk him down and they arrest the captain in question. However, Picard realizes that the Cardassians have not been acting in good faith and threatens that they will be watching them in the future. So, this, of course, is the first Cardassian episode. In many ways, this is a precursor for Deep Space Nine. I think this is one of the episodes that inspired a lot of the creation of Deep Space Nine, which happened, well, they first started creating it 1 year later, but of course would air 2 years after this, because, of course, the Cardassians became the main adversaries of Deep Space Nine and were explored a lot more. And the other way this is a precursor to Deep Space Nine is Chief Miles O'Brien, because this arguably is the first O'Brien episode we get in the Star Trek franchise. For the most part, O'Brien was kind of just the guy in the transporter room who sat there and cheerfully beamed people up and down. Now, there were examples previous to this episode where he was used a bit more than simply that. However, this is the first one that really focused on him as kind of the main character of the episode and explored his characters more as simply more than just a background character. And he would be utilized a bit more in Next Generation before he moved over to Deep Space Nine a couple years later. And of course became a huge main cast member and a fan favorite. So much so that Lower Decks said that he was the best officer ever to serve in Starfleet. And I've always loved this episode. This has always been one of my favorite Next Generation episodes. And honestly, I first saw this, I don't think, it wasn't the exact year it came out. I think it was 1 year after it came out, but it was before Deep Space Nine had been announced or conceived, or before I even heard of Deep Space Nine. And in fact, so it took me a while before I actually saw the episode Ensign Row, which is the next appearance of the Cardassians. And so for the longest time, this was the only episode I'd had known the Cardassians for. And I instantly loved them. They instantly, after just this one episode, they instantly became one of my favorite adversaries, or favorite alien adversary species. And because it's funny, because Next Generation has had a lot of other like one-off aliens. Like when I was reading reviews of season 4, a lot of people mentioned the Tolarians, whatever they're called. There's so many species in Star Trek that have a very similar sounding name. But that aliens that appeared in that episode, Suddenly Human, where they explored their culture a bit. But it's funny because I never saw them as anything more than a one-off. Like, watching the episode, I knew they were a one-off. I didn't think they would appear again. I didn't want them to appear again. And so I wasn't surprised when they never appeared again. And there's other, of course, many other examples of these one-off aliens that you know are just there for the one episode. But the Cardassians, like, I instantly say these guys are going to appear again, and they fucking should appear again. This is a great species. You said explore them more. Now they eventually become one of the most prominent alien species of the 90s Trek area that are usually mentioned along other fan favorites such as Romulans, Klingons, and the Borg. They're always seen as kind of a lesser because they're more more localized in Deep Space Nine, although in later seasons of Next Generation they appeared a bit more, and of course there were several mentions and appearances of them in Voyager as well, but they mainly are looked upon as a Deep Space Nine villain. But yeah, they're still seen as one of the most prominent alien species of the franchise. So, and it all started with this episode, and I don't know if the intention was to make them a recurring villain. I will say that this episode is, in fact, inconsistent with later appearances of the Cardassians. The way they're described in this episode, their technology is far inferior to Starfleet, and they're not really a match for the really good Starfleet ships. Like the Cardassian ship in this episode fired on the Enterprise with its shields down and barely did any damage to it. And then a fully armed Cardassian warship had the ability to remove the shields of a Starfleet ship, and they were still got destroyed by them without doing any damage to them. So their technology, they were seen as really inferior. That, of course, changed in later appearances. The Cardassians' technology was, shown to be on par with Starfleet's technology, and at the very least were a match for them, and in fact engaged in a major war with them in the later seasons of Deep Space Nine. So this is obviously a retcon. Now, when I mentioned this before in a couple of my videos, and people tried to come up with in-universe excuses to why their technology is different in this episode than later appearances, and that just makes my head hurt. I just really hate it when people do that. Just accept that this was a writing change. There is no in-universe reason for it. It's a writing change. They didn't know the Cardassians were going to be a major species when they wrote this episode, and later when they were going to make them a later species, they had to retcon and change a few things to pretend this episode didn't happen in order to tell the kind of stories that they want to tell. And I don't think there's anything wrong with that. Now, I do have complained about canon issues and inconsistencies in Trek before, but a lot of them, such as this, I acknowledge that it's definitely a retcon, but it's not a terrible one. Like, there are some terrible retcons in Star Trek, such as the biggest one being Bashir being genetically enhanced coming out of fucking nowhere. That's the worst retcon. And another one was like Cisco being a prophet baby. That was stupid. But this one I'm fine with, but I just want to acknowledge that it is a retcon, and I hate it when people try to say it's not. It is one, but that's fine. You can just accept the fact it's a retcon, but say it was a necessary one and move on with your life. That's what I do. But it just makes it weird watching this episode now in the context of seeing what the Cardassians have become, because it's definitely, they're portrayed a bit differently here, but that's fine. You go back and watch the original series, the Klingons behave absolutely nothing like Klingons, so again, you just gotta accept that the writing evolved and changed on this species, which I'm perfectly fine with. But anyway, they obviously did something right to so captivate me and want me so badly to see these species appear a bit more. In fact, I remember when Deep Space Nine was first announced, and I heard that the Cardassians were going to be the main adversary. I remember going, yes! Like, I was so happy, so excited about that Deep Space Nine, by the way. Shout out. Anyway, so yeah, I think it was really effective in that regard. Now, this is also an interesting episode, as I said, because it's a character story for Chief O'Brien, a character who hadn't really been explored that much. We get scenes with him and Keiko, who had only been introduced in the episode previous to this one, the one that aired just before this episode, Data's Day, where they first introduced Keiko by having her get married to Miles O'Brien all of a sudden. And I love how, because that was kind of an out of nowhere thing for these side characters, and implied there was this deeper relationship between Data and O'Brien and Keiko and all the stuff that happened off screen, which did seem kind of out of nowhere. So I do love how they explored that a bit more in the very next episode, where we see Keiko and Miles sharing dinner together and having, going through their differences, and Miles had their different upbringings, how Miles going to introduce her to all this disgusting sounding Irish food. And just the way they interact with each other. Now, one thing about this episode that did kind of bother me about Miles is how obtuse he is to his own prejudice, because it's very obvious that he is prejudiced against Cardassians, which, as this episode explains, it makes sense. In fact, it becomes a character trait for him on Deep Space Nine. Although on Deep Space Nine, his prejudice towards the Cardassians tends to be justified at every turn. Where here, this episode challenges it a bit more, but it still makes it understandable of how it happened, where he was involved in several skirmishes with the Cardassians during the war, in which it was, the Cardassians were killing and slaughtering civilians. So you could kind of understand why he would see them in a negative light, shall we say. But as I said, the issue is that he was completely obtuse to how he keeps pretending, when Keiko asks him, "Oh, how do you feel about the Cardassians?" It's "Oh, I like them fine. I got no issue with them." And as soon as he shows up to him, he's instantly an asshole to them. When this one guy says, just innocently, casually, "Hey, do you want to come 10 forward, have a drink with me?" He's gets right up in his face. It's "Look, if my captain tells me to share information with you, I'll do it. But who I spend my free time with is none of your business." Right up in his face. And then the very next scene is "Oh, yeah, I don't have a problem with the Cardassians." Dude, clearly you do. But I think, one could simply pass that up as he is in denial on his own prejudice, which is fair. I do totally buy that. But I think maybe they should have toned it down a little bit, because he seems really obtuse to his prejudice, which is very fucking obvious. And I do really like the scene. I think it's a very powerful scene where he does end up going to 10 forward and drink with the Cardassian and try to see things from his perspective, and realize that the Cardassians have their own worries and concerns. But then he tells the story about how his time during the war, where he was thrown a phaser by a civilian who was in danger, and so he simply fired a phaser at the attacking Cardassian and didn't realize that the phaser was set to kill, and that the man just vaporized in front of him, and that he had never killed anyone before, and this is his first time that he ever killed someone, and how he valued life and never even hurt insects before. And what he ultimately says to him is, "It's not you I hate, Cardassian. It's I hate what I became because of you," which is a powerful scene, and I do love the way it was performed. The actor who plays O'Brien, of course, is an amazing actor, but he is still being prejudiced in this moment, to be clear, because he is saying "you, Cardassian," accusing this one man for the faults of his entire race, and more specifically his military and his government. Now, he is a military officer, but still, to say "you" as in you represent absolutely everything, you are the Cardassians, is kind of stereotyping, prejudiced. And also he's saying, "Well, I don't hate you, I hate what I became because of you." It's just a roundabout way of saying "I hate you." So he still comes off as prejudiced in this moment. And it also shows that he's still extremely bitter about his experiences in the war, and it has not let those feelings go. But that, I actually think, works brilliantly for the story, because this main plot is about Captain Maxwell, who is also extremely bitter about his experience during the Cardassian War and will not let it go, but to a much larger extreme. So it makes it all the more powerful when O'Brien is able to talk Maxwell down from his actions, because he can relate to also being bitter about their experiences in this war. And talking about that scene, where O'Brien beams over and talks Maxwell down, which was the height of the episode. It was the climax of the episode. Was an amazing way to finish. What makes this episode so fucking powerful and emotional for me, that rather than ending in a firefight or whatnot, it ends with O'Brien going over and having a chat with his old friend and reminiscing about old times, and they share their shared experiences and their shared trauma that they still have from those experiences. And of course, Maxwell feels it even more because his family was killed in the war by Cardassians. But it just shows that he's kind of letting his trauma dictate his actions more than O'Brien is, and so O'Brien is still able to see the bigger picture and still able to see, look, Picard's not going to let you go. If you try to destroy this supply ship, he will destroy your ship. He will fire upon you, and you're in a no-way situation, and the best thing to do now is just stand down. And it was so momental because O'Brien didn't actually say those things to him. This was not on the nose dialogue. Instead, they reminisced about old times, and then they sang that song, which was kind of representative of the situation about death and war, and how after sitting there singing the song together, he realizes, Maxwell realizes through their reminiscing, through their singing, I'm not going to win this one, am I? And Miles just very sadly, no, you're not. Such a powerful scene. Is one of the most powerful scenes in the entire show, in my opinion. It brings me to tears almost every time I watch it. Even though they performed the song badly, I still get that song stuck in my head. It was such a great, subtle way to explore the situation, explore their shared trauma. So damn good. Now, while I'm on the subject of O'Brien, though, I do have to mention something I mentioned in my review of the episode Impact Nor over on Deep Space Nine, because that episode retconned again. This time I think is a bad retcon. They retconned that O'Brien was this big war hero who led troops into battle and killed tons of Cardassians, which, going by this episode, is very inconsistent. Now, again, you could do mental gymnastics to try to justify, well, maybe this time where he shot that Cardassian was the first time he killed, but then after he became this great war hero. But I don't think that lines up thematically with what this episode was trying to say. I think that would be inconsistent. And yes, it is a retcon, and this time I don't think it's a good one. No, I do not like it. And I did mention that in my review of episode Impact Nor. I think that was sloppy writing on the writer's part. Didn't actually help that episode, which wasn't that good. Impact Nor, not this one. But anyway, so then there's Gul Macet, played by Mark Alamo. Now, talking about how this episode sets up Deep Space Nine, of course, you have to mention Mark Alamo. Now, this isn't the first time he appeared in Star Trek. He had appeared previous as a Romulan commander in that silly episode, The Neutral Zone. And he appeared after this episode in Time Zero before he would make his classic role as Gul Dukat in Deep Space Nine. Now, Alamo, of course, I love how they, similar to what they did with Armor Shimmerman, where they see someone play a alien for the first time and think that they really exemplified that alien, so let's make them a main character. And that was absolutely the brilliant way to do it. I love how they brought Mark Alamo back to be Gul Dukat in Deep Space Nine. Now, I do understand, though, why they created a different character and not brought back Macet, who had actually facial hair. And everyone always talks about how it's the only Cardassian seen as having facial hair. And I think maybe they kind of retconned it later that Cardassians don't have facial hair, and that's why we never see it again. But that's fine. But anyway, yeah, I understand why they created a new character of Dukat, because Dukat is distinctly different than Macet. In fact, there's been B-canon books that explain that Macet is Dukat's cousin, and that's why they look alike. And but they had very different upbringings, and they're very different. In fact, most other B-Can that brought Masset back portrayed him as like really honorable, although he's not really that honorable in this episode when I watch it. But he's certainly not as dastardly as Dukat, and definitely not as despicable as Dukat, who's essentially just another Hitler. So yes, I understand why they created a different character, and I understand why they brought back the same actor, because he did such an amazing job. So yes, bring him back. However, it's not the same character they want him to play, so change the name. And so I'm perfectly happy with that. And I love Masset's interactions with Picard. And I love how they sort of, the way they do the little diplomacy dance, they're both really good at it, and I love seeing that. But it was really cool how at the end of the episode where, they arrest Benjamin Maxwell, and Masset's like, I, for one, am glad to see him under lock and key. And Picard is kind of being like stern with him in this moment, and then you find out why, where he reveals like, hey, because Benjamin Maxwell was claiming that the Cardassians were arming for war, and that's why he was attacking them. And Picard's just like, that's irrelevant, it doesn't matter, we still have to you still can't go around destroying Cardassian ships. It's still not okay, because we're trying to maintain this peace. But in this moment, Picard admits, hey, he was right. I know he was right. And then Masset's like, well, if you knew he was right, why didn't you support him? Why didn't you go board the supply ship? He's like, well, because if I did that, we wouldn't be having this pleasant conversation, and instead both sides would be arming for war. So I think it's a smart way, because he does know that having peace rather than war is the preferred outcome. However, he doesn't want to be naive or dumb about it or do it at all costs, and realize that, hey, and that's why he gives Masset this very stern warning. It's like, we'll be watching. Tell your superiors that. Like saying, like, look, I don't want to start a war, but I'm not going to let you get away with this shit. Great scene. Absolutely love that. But speaking of a great scene involving Picard in this episode, you also get another great scene where he encounters Benjamin Maxwell. Now, Maxwell, I haven't talked about yet, was played by Bob Gutton, which is my first introduction to this actor. I would later recognize him. He's been in a lot of stuff, but I mostly recognized him from Shawshank Redemption, where he played the Warden. In fact, when he showed up in that movie, I was like, hey, it's Benjamin Maxwell from The Wounded. He's a very good actor too, and he's very good at playing despicable people, which is why he usually does that. But in this episode, it's not really a despicable person. He's more of a misguided one, and he does an amazing job at that as well. And again, I already talked about the scene with O'Brien, which was fucking fantastic, but there's also the scene with Picard where the acting was just so crisp. I loved our interaction, because Benjamin comes on all happy and free, like, oh, Picard, I'm glad that you're here. I'm going to tell you what's going on. You'll be totally on my side. Where Picard's just like, dude, you're going around like killing all these people with no fucking evidence, no proof of orders. This is not okay. There's nothing you can say to me that's going to make this okay. And then he flat out, makes that clear. Like, he has this stern approach with him from the beginning, and he makes that clear to Maxwell. And I love some of the dialogue I always like quote or have in my mind, where Maxwell's like, oh, we had to act now, lives were at stake, and Picard's like, whose lives, why? Like, just the way he was sternly like questioning everything he did, where Maxwell's finally like, oh, it's getting a bit stuffy in here, like a bureaucrat's office. And then Picard just has to lay into him and be like, look, nothing you did justifies this turning over the peace, blah blah blah. And it was just an amazing scene, one of the best Picard moments of him being really stern and laying down the law. Now, one thing I do question about this episode is, after that encounter, Picard lets Maxwell return to his ship. Now he says it's 4 appearances, and he's like the only alternative is that I tow your ship in disgrace. But at this point, haven't Maxwell already committed war crimes? Like he already killed a whole bunch of Cardassians without Starfleet permission and threatening a peace. Shouldn't he be arrested now? It seems like the only reason they let him return to the ship is so they could have that final scene with O'Brien singing, which, as I said, amazing scene. But it does seem like there was a little bit of contrivance there in order to get that scene, because it seems like he should have been arrested, especially Massette. Why is Massette okay with him, Picard, letting Maxwell return to his ship? It seems like Massette would be wanting Maxwell's head, let alone, it's okay for him to go back to his ship. So, I don't know. Something about that I don't really buy, but still a great episode. Still an amazing episode. So, my rating for The Wounded out of 10 is a 9 excellent. Very, very powerful episode. Definitely in the upper echelon of Star Trek Next Generation episodes. Not quite a 10, but very close to one. It's a very strong 9. Very powerful episode, in my opinion. One that always gets me right here. And made me love the Cardassians as an enemy, and made me love O'Brien as a character. So, there we go. So that is it for my review of The Wounded. Be sure to check out my channel as I cover many more Star Trek stuff, including Strange New Worlds, and I also cover other shows such as The Expanse, Star Wars Rebels, and more. So be sure to subscribe so you can keep up with all that, and thanks a lot for watching.